Hi kids, I hope you're all safe and sound in your homes right about now. And I look forward to seeing you all and your cats on Tuesday. But before that, I want to introduce the topic of this week, which is going to be database aesthetics. And I want to begin with a short recap of what we discussed last time that we saw each other when the world was a different place. And that was about narrative, because I think it will provide an important counterpoint to the cultural significance of the database that I will address after. So last time we discussed the role of stories and narrativity in society. And narrative we defined as a number of causally related events structured with a beginning, middle, and end. But often we also discussed, we infer or project this causality, these cause and effect relationships, where in fact there are none. So we came to speak of narrativity as stories existing outside of any medium of instantiation. Narrativity is what makes transmediation or transmediality possible. And that is taking content from one medium and putting it into another medium. So, for instance, adapting a novel to a play or a video game or a ballet. So narrativity then is this capacity of stories to be transmediated. It is story structure decoupled from any medium. So thinking in terms of causes and effects is in fact so ingrained in our consciousness that we tend to see stories everywhere, even in paintings or sculptures which are not technically time-based media, or in the video that we saw by Heider and Simmel with the moving geometric figures. So we often make a narrative out of our own lives as well, and we adjust or rewrite this narrative as we go along. In order to accommodate new information and maintain its overall coherence. So we add causality in retrospect to make things fitting again, saying that looking back, it was always very clear that a certain relationship was never going to work, or even while you tried some divergent career paths, it would be meant to be that you end up in marketing or whatever. So some people like Oliver Sacks even go one step further and say that we are this life story, we are our life narrative. So we use narrative as a way to give meaning and form to time. We can only make sense of life if we relate it to a beginning and an end. So we make stories because we cannot as humans really stand this indeterminate interval, this middle. Frank Kermode compared human life to a ticking clock for that reason. So where the tick is birth, then the talk would be death, or the tick is Genesis and the talk would be apocalypse, where we seem to be at right now. And all the old stories, the epics, the biblical stories, in a way, use storytelling to make this indeterminate, unorganized interval meaningful. So it could be to explain human life in a private sense. It could also be an explanation of all of human life on the planet, so the origin of mankind, or the origin of the nation, for instance. Stories always work like that. So it would be another example when you try to imagine how you would tell your future kids or grandkids about the current pandemic and your experience of it. So last time we already began to question whether narrative is really, in fact, the only form to give meaning to experience and to time. And we started to consider some alternative forms like time-lapse video, the rotoscope technique. We considered the possibility of the episodic personality with Galen Strawson, and we applied all these concepts to the work of Richard Linklater. So as promised, this week we are going to examine database aesthetics and the database narrative. So we start by outlining a work by Lev Manovich called The Language of New Media. And here he says that in the computer age, the database has started to replace narrative all along the lines as our primary means of meaning making. So Manovich described a certain shift. He is saying that where earlier well-defined narratives would be in our society, so we had many of these like grand stories to explain everything, but we had a little standalone information, so sometimes not enough information. And today the opposite is at stake. He's saying that in the computer age we have too much information and too few narratives that can tie all this information together. So as we know, during the last decades, because of processes like digitalization and datafication, like the transmission of all kinds of information to quantifiable data, also information about us and what makes us human. Of course, we have more organizing system in place. So the number of digital databases surrounding us has grown exponentially. And this has major practical implications for our lives and our societies. So when you think how many times a day would you encounter something that uses a database, for instance, you maybe use Netflix or social media, but also your doctor has a database and puts information about you there. Or when you want to look up sources at the university library, that's also a database. But these very concrete and practical examples of databases, that's not really what Manovich is talking about. He is considering the database's cultural significance as a form that helps us to order and make sense of the world around us. So he says that it's a cultural form or a symbolic form, which basically means that it's more than just a handy way to look up stuff. So in this respect, he claims that the database is replacing narrative. And he then goes on to list a number of important differences to make sense of these different representational strategies. He's saying that narrative is the outcome of a process of selection. So it operates according to a certain economy in what to include. So we could call this a symbolic logic. Certain items are meant to stand in for other items, so to speak. So for every element, like every character or every event, another one could have been chosen. So last time when we were trying to write down our life story in a couple of minutes, no one included all the people they have ever met or all the cups of coffee that they ever drank. We tend to include only the highlights, the most meaningful events. Only your best friends will make it to your life story. So this kind of selection also implies valuation and hierarchies. And archives, and especially the digital database, because of increased storage space, do not necessarily have the same sense of selection and compression. So they can be seen as more inclusive and less discriminatory because sampling is not always needed. So a related difference is that between the finite and the potentially infinite. As we have said, narrative amounts to a cause and effect trajectory with a beginning, middle, and end. And its organizing principle is the plot, that is a structure of relationships by which these events that are included are given meaning. So closure in narrative is of vital importance since the end determines the meaning of the whole. The database, on the other hand, according to Manovich, represents the world as a list of items without a beginning or an end, and refuses to order this list. So every item possesses the same significance of every other item. So it's always possible to add another element without dramatically changing the meaning of the whole. And it has to be said that this is a somewhat simplistic view, and in reality databases can have a multitude of different forms, and they can have very sophisticated ordering systems, they can be hierarchical, but to defend Manovich, let's keep in mind that he is talking here about the cultural form, so the way it influences how we view the world. So to explain how this works, Manovich evokes the difference between the paradigm and the syntagm. These are the two structural dimensions of all science systems. So the syntagm is, we could say, a combination or a sequence of signs. So for instance, in language, a speaker produces an utterance by threading together one element after another in a linear sequence, so the way that I'm trying to form sentences now. Then the paradigmatic dimension of this would be the sets of all the different elements that you could choose from in order to come to this sequence or this sentence. So in language, that would be all nouns, for instance, or all synonyms of one particular word that I could have chosen from. So in narrative, the paradigm, this database of choices of which the story is built, remains implicit, whereas the narrative resulting from it is explicit. And then the point that Manovich makes is that in new media, this situation is reversed. So now we have the paradigm that is materially present, the interactive interfaces, for instance, that present the user with this complete and explicit menu of available choices. So the syntagm or the narrative as a string of subsequent choices is only resulting from this interface. So it is dematerialized, it only comes after, and it loses its privilege. So another example would be, as you see on the slide, the choice of all the different sweaters I could have chosen from my wardrobe this morning is that the paradigm, and I have chosen this outfit. So like a sentence, you have these different elements of your outfit that are syntagmatic, we could say. And this, lastly, also entails a move from the temporal to the spatial realm of representations in media. So narrative is obviously bound to the linear order of language through syntax. So it is a temporal technology. It presents things as they unfold in time. And by contrast, data sets and databases lend themselves more to spatial displays. So a question I want you to think about for next Tuesday is, how would you capture your life in a database? So last time I asked you to write down your life story in a couple of minutes, and here the equivalent exercise would be to start thinking of yourself in terms of quantifiable information. So what would a database of your life look like? What elements would you choose to store or leave out, and think about ways to visualize it, for instance, and how to organize this. So let me know on Tuesday. So it will probably not have escaped your attention that Manovich presents the database and narrative in a quite binary way, like a binary opposition. But in practice, we see that the relation between these two modes of organizational practices is rather characterized by mutual inspiration. So we see a lot of hybrid forms between the two. And this is where we come to database aesthetics. So we speak of database aesthetic when feedback from the database informs and transforms narrative strategies and all kinds of artistic practices. So as we all know, we are bombarded with information on a daily basis and through different channels at the same time. And artists are picking up on this and responding in creative ways. So how do you design a situation that involves an overload of information or that presents different forms of data simultaneously? According to Kristin Veel from the University of Copenhagen, works of art that display a database aesthetic are marked by a mode of inventory that, I quote, prioritizes simultaneity over selection and probes the boundaries of contemporary conditions of attention. So this way, according to Christiane Paul, database aesthetic itself has become an important cultural narrative of our time, constituting a shift towards a relational, networked approach to gathering and creating knowledge about cultural specifics. So because databases strip information of their context, we can access any given record in multiple contexts at the same time. So they increase the number of possible combinations of data, we could say. The organization of data thus increasingly becomes a mutable and multilinear practice or process. So this is to be seen back in visual representations in art, but also in the organizational aspect, so the way that artworks are structured. And I'm now going to give a couple of examples. This is Time Code. It's a film that presents the viewer, as you see, with 4 simultaneous camera positions, which breaks up the narrative continuity that is normally associated with cinema. And it operates according to a logic of simultaneity. So as a viewer, you have to choose what to pay attention to at what time. You have to create your own syntagmatic sequence out of these 4 screens. So another totally different example of database aesthetics is what we could call archival artworks in the visual arts. These are artworks that incorporate principles of archives, of archival organizations, such as lists or inventories or storages. So the example that we see here is Idessa Hendele's The Teddy Bear Project. And the Teddy Bear Project is an enormous installation of found family album photographs, or actually the artist often bought old family albums. And she selected these 3,000 pictures on the basis of a single motif that you might have guessed by now, which is there had to be a teddy bear somewhere in the picture. And the photographs have then been categorized according to specific typologies. Basically, different groups of people are handling or holding the teddy bear in the picture. And that can be like a group of soldiers, so all kinds of pictures of soldiers with teddy bear, or lesbian couples. And Ernst van Alphen says that Hendeles does this for a reason. What she wants to do is make a point about the positivistic presentation of data through the teddy bear. So she wants to make a point especially about the comfort that we have in seemingly objective but quite misleading and arbitrary presentations of data in all these very strict categories. And then what is more comfortable than a teddy bear, right? So this last example that I wanted to show you is from literature. And it is the 9th chapter of Mark Danielewski's House of Leaves. House of Leaves is a very big book about a house that is bigger on the inside than it is on the outside, which is in itself kind of a metaphor for the book and the novel in digital times. But anyway, this 9th chapter is fittingly titled Labyrinth, and that's also what we are presented with here, because we see that the text is overrun with all kinds of annotations that make for a labyrinthine space. So some are crawling up the margins, as you can see. We have text in squared boxes, we have little screens, so to speak, text that has been written upside down or backwards, and the trails of footnotes that lists all kinds of things that are not in the house, in fact. So, for instance, all the houses it does not resemble, all the objects that were not found in this house. So if we would try to read this in a narrative way and read it in a linear way, we would soon have this experience of overload, and also figure out that it's probably not meant to be read like this. So you have this overload of superfluous details, which kind of renders the text illegible, unreadable. So these were just some examples, and now I have as a last question to you, or actually it's not a question, come up with your own examples of database narrative and database aesthetics in film, literature, or video games. And I would like to discuss this further with you on Tuesday. I have a second video with examples from the electronic literature database, and also a link to this database where you can find more case studies, possibly for your paper. I think the PowerPoint is kind of blocking my head in that video. I still need to figure out things, so bear with me. I hope this will get better in a couple of weeks. See you soon.